Topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
And born to be alive, we certainly are. You're listening to Until Now with Rosie Pica on W4CY Radio, where we talk to ordinary people with extraordinary experiences. If you wish to join the live chat, just go to w4cy.com and remember to connect and like on Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, etc. And speaking about being born to be alive, the one thing we're guaranteed in being alive, pretty much we all heard the story that we get death and taxes, but I think there's one other thing that we get that we often overlook. We're guaranteed death, taxes and lies. Personally, professionally, politically, criminally, though there may not be much distinction between some of those for some people. We even have a commerce system that is dedicated to lying. We just remarket it and call it advertising. And we even have governments that rely on propaganda and lies. So what then is a lie? And are there grades or hierarchies to lying? And who better than my next guest for today, Steve Van Aperen, who is affectionately also known as the Human Lie Detector. Now, myself, I come from a background in law enforcement, and so does Steve. So this is the perfect time of year to join the chat live and ask you questions of Steve so that you can avoid being deceived, fooled, or scammed, be it personally from those near and dear to you, or those that aren't so near and dear. And we know as former police that what happens at Christmas doesn't necessarily stay with Christmas. It's for a whole new year and sometimes a lifetime. So now to get that heads up on deception without being reliant on technology, as there are many budding would-be detectives, I believe, out there, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome my guest for today. Steve, welcome.
Thank you, Rosie. How are you?
I'm great. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your background and how you evolved into becoming the human lie detector, because I think all of us would love to have one of those bullshit barometers on us permanently for people that we come across.
Well, yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, everybody hates being lied to. And often in life, we're lied to for a myriad of reasons. And, I like to compare the situation that Bill Clinton found himself in many years ago when it came to Monica Lewinsky. He lied and lied and lied about it, and he got deeper and deeper and deeper. So as human beings, even though we lie ourselves and we're annoyed when people lie to us, we still want to have the ability to read when people are lying and how they do it. But to answer your question, my background is in 96, I was a police detective, and I'd spent 14 years in South Australia and Victoria Police here in Australia. And I was always interested in psychological profiling, believe it or not, what made serial killers and serial sex offenders tick. So I went over to the FBI Behavioural Sciences Unit, but the more I learned about profiling, the more interested I'd become in cognitive and behavioural interviewing. I wanted to know effectively why some of the detectives that I used to work with were terrible at picking up lies and reading people, and others were okay.
And again, I'd like to say there, were they terrible at picking up lies, or was there a benefit in them in overlooking the lies is also another aspect.
Absolutely. Look, I think from my previous background in law enforcement, I remember working with a detective, and he said to me once, he said, "I hate being lied to." I said, "You need to get a new job," because
Exactly. But we do come into this still naively as the human beings we are. I remember my first time being cross-examined in court, and I thought, my God, you're lying. You're in court. You're meant to tell the truth. I sort of thought there was some parameter or benchmark that says you must stop lying now. It was a rude awakening to discover for some people, they continually, as their lips are moving, as Judge Judy, my favorite judge on US television, likes to say, for teenagers, if their lips are moving, they're lying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting because um, often we don't want to believe that we're being lied to in some circumstances. We're influenced by personalities, and I do a lot of public speaking. I remember saying to a group one day that you know, we are not only influenced by the personality, but we often want to believe that what we're being told is the truth, especially when it comes to, people who are close to us and whatnot. So usually all the
Yep.
telltale signs are there, but we tend to ignore them or not pay any particular attention. And we do so at our peril.
And I think that's exactly, I would think that's where I mentioned, is there a gradient in lies, like to define what actually a lie is, and then a gradient of lying. For example, if I look in the mirror and I say, to someone near and dear, does my butt look big in this? Of course, I want them to lie. I want them to tell me I look sensational and fabulous. And we do this for our loved ones. We eat their cooking that may otherwise not to be our liking. And, my son, if he's going to lie, he actually doesn't do it. He just looks at me and he goes, do you want me to answer that, Mum? And he gives me the option, so I have a way out, as in no, not necessarily for me to know. So with distinction, and because you and I come from a background where there are criminal lies, as opposed to, obviously, we've seen in the arena recently with a lot of political lies, and then just your general everyday, how you doing? Fine, when you're absolutely lousy. So do you take note in your role as a human lie detector of a certain benchmark of what you consider to be a true lie?
Yeah, look, I think the definition of a lie is where somebody intentionally misleads somebody knowing that what they're saying is in fact false. So it's their intention to mislead because they know what they're saying is incorrect or, for whatever reason. But I also look at the motivation behind the lie.
Exactly. I was going to say, is there another parameter like mislead with an intention to obtain a benefit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fraudsters are a classic example.
Yes.
I mean, I know some very intelligent people who have been ripped off, hundreds of thousands of dollars because they've been promised returns on investments that were simply, impossible to believe. But the fraudster appealed to a particular emotion, which in this case was greed, even though these were, quite intelligent people. But they wanted to believe that they would return or get a great return on their investment. So, when you think of the reasons we lie, I mean, there's so many. There are a myriad of reasons. I mean, we lie to impress people. We lie to get ahead in life. We lie to receive some sort of advantage. We lie to impress a potential partner or mate. So we all lie. In fact, I was reading a study a little while ago, and the author, a psychologist, said that it's part of our normal development to have the ability to deceive, because it's believed that if we can't have the ability to deceive, that we will be deceived ourselves. So, and often people say, Steve, who make the best liars? Politicians or who? But the reality is, politicians are terrible liars. In my experience, pedophiles are very good at lying. They're very good at manipulating their victims, very good at manipulating their treatment providers and everyone else in between, because they literally live the lie. But I mean, when you consider firstly what a lie is, and then the reasons, the underlying motivations about why we do it. I mean, in some cases, lying is rewarded. Think, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean,
I was
think for
just going to
example.
say that there was just, before you give that example, there's just a question that is there ever a good reason to lie? And I think we can think in circumstances where we want to maintain hope. or we want people to persist past deficiencies, I think that might be a good opportunity to lie. Do you come across any within a criminal capacity that you see that there's a good reason, obviously, to avoid being killed with some informants? I see that's their reason for lying.
Yeah, look, with people who are committing crimes, obviously the purpose, it's interesting. I say this a lot. People often won't lie to you. They'll just edit the information they supply you with. They only lie when they have no other option or there's nowhere else to go. So they'll be evasive, they'll be omissive, they'll be dismissive, they'll sidestep the issue, they won't answer the question, and all that type of thing. So only when somebody's actually put into a corner where they have no other option will they usually lie. So they'll edit what they think is important. Bill Clinton once said, whilst my answers were legally accurate, I did not volunteer information. So we call that lying by omission. So people will tell you what they want you to know. So I often say what is more important is what people don't tell you. But to give an example,
that's my strategy. I've got to tell you, I lie by omission rather than being direct. And I can't be persecuted so much in court for that. Yes, Your Honour. Did you say that? No, I did not.
Absolutely. And to give an example of where lying is rewarded, I was on a show called The Poker Star, and these were very good players, and they're rewarded if they can bluff their opponents into believing that they have a really good hand when maybe they don't.
Yes.
So there's a typical case where somebody's rewarded for a form of deception, I guess, bluffing, whereas in the criminal sphere, people lie to avoid detection, prosecution, conviction. But also, interestingly enough, research has shown that men and women lie for different reasons. Women will often lie to make somebody else feel better about themselves, whereas men will often lie to make themselves look better. So the techniques that we use are similar, but for different reasons.
And again, there are careers that are born out of lying. Like I know, like working in the public speaking industry, the same as yourself, that, there's a lot of coaching and sales techniques that go into, those in any form of sales industry. And that involves a lot of training of body language so that way you appear and the subliminal cues you give to another present as if you are genuine, as if you are altruistic, as if you are coming from what's best for them, when the reality is you're just after a sale.
That's true, but having said that, I also believe that if you're going to mock sincerity, whether it be by words or by body language, you're going to have to be really good at it, because often people are very good at picking up when people are insincere. And, one of the things that I teach people to look for in body language is to look for conflict or contradiction between what a person is saying and what their body language is in fact stating. Because
yes, as they're talking and they're nodding their head no.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So, but often, micro expressions or facial configurations will give the game away. So we may say something, but at the same time, we're indicating something completely different. Like smiling is a classic example. If you watch somebody who engages in a false smile, usually the smile takes place from the nose and below, whereas a real smile utilizes the orbicularis oculi muscles and the zygomatic major. So usually when
meaning
somebody
the
smiles,
eye and the cheekbone.
Yeah, basically,
so everyone can understand. Let's put it in layman's terms. It's 9 o'clock at night in the US. They might be ready for bed going, okay, where's my dictionary? Let me look that one up. Just put them on pause.
Well, let me simplify it for you. Basically, the corner of the lips will be pulled upwards in the direction of the corner of the eyes, and there'll be crinkling around the eyes, which engages, several muscle groups in the face. And I'm sure, a lot of your listeners will have been in a situation where, somebody's talking and then they'll smile and they just get a feel that, you know what, that's not genuine.
Yes, exactly.
And it's
I just want to address a couple of questions that are coming here, which, and those that do want to join in the chat, it's, w4cy.com and ask your questions. We've got the Human Lie Detector on, and we're going to be going into exactly what facial expressions we can pick up from someone to detect if they are lying. So do you have a 6-point spectrum that if their face looks like this, they're lying, or 10 key points to look for, or?
I actually have 14, but
14. Okay,
I
well,
do.
well, let's start with some so we can put it to the test and we can see how good we are tonight. Do you really love me? I'll watch that smile not quite make it up. Right, you're out.
Absolutely. But see, look, I think and this is, I travel around the world teaching everyone from intelligence agencies to homicide detectives to corporates how to read people and detect deception through verbal, nonverbal, and paralinguistic. Now, here's the problem.
Yes.
Often people will listen to somebody and they'll get a gut feel that what they're being told is not true or a lie.
Yes.
Now, what I teach people is to put a methodology behind that gut feel. Now, what I mean by that is rather than just rely on the content of what somebody tells you, we need to look for several areas, or in particular, three key areas. And those areas are one, firstly, body language. So we need to look for conflict or contradiction between what a person's saying and what their body language is in fact stating. And that could be anything from hand to face, masking, concealment, or blocking behaviour. So
Yes.
somebody's talking and
Defensive modes.
yeah, absolutely. So inadvertently, their hand will go up towards their face, but at the last moment there'll be a deflection. So there could be, cursory nose touch, eye rub or ear touch or something. Now, if you've got an itch, what do? You scratch it to relieve that itch. Now, sometimes it's interesting because I've seen some, psychologists and behavioural analysts say that often when we know that what we're saying is not true, it creates some internal conflict or anxiety.
Yes.
And subconsciously, in an effort to stop those false words from coming out of our mouth, our hand will go towards our mouth, but we realise we can't stand and talk to somebody with our hand in front of our mouth. So there'll be a small deflection at the last moment. So holistically, what your listeners need to look for is three areas. So that's body language. The second area is the content and structure of that lie. And I'll give you some great examples a little bit later. But I may be able to think of a lie, but can I effectively communicate that lie with believability and credibility?
And do you
that's
notice
very
a
hard to do.
difference between when they talk in generalities or those that go way too much detail that is almost like, you really want me to buy this, don't you? You really want me to buy what you're telling me.
Absolutely. Sometimes people will oversell it. Other times people will be very evasive when they respond.
Yes.
I remember interviewing somebody and I said, what time did you leave the office last Thursday night? And the response was, generally, I like to leave at 7:30 p.m. But they're not answering the question.
Yep.
So the biggest point that I could suggest that people need to pay attention to, and it's the most simplified point, and that is the person answering your question, or are they sidestepping the issue altogether? And we see that with a lot of politicians. We see that with a lot of people when the questions become a little bit hard. I mean, I've interviewed people for over 76 homicide cases. One of the things I've found, there is similarities in behaviour, and that is often they'll sidestep the issue or won't answer the question, or they'll be evasive.
Yes,
or
evasive. Yeah.
But also they'll deflect. Sometimes I've seen this happen. People will contact me and they'll say, "Look, I asked my partner if he or she is having an affair," and they'll say something like, "Why would I do something like that? I'm not that type of person." But we'll notice two things there. One is they're not answering the question. Two is they're deflecting. But thirdly, what they're doing is actually taking the pressure off themselves, and actually, in some cases, they'll accuse their partner. So that's really important to take or pay attention to as well.
Exactly. So they're not necessary to go checking through their phones and their email accounts. And, the direct approach I always feel is the best approach because, and it's the same when I read books. I don't generally read what is written. I read what is not written or not said that you would expect to be there. So is that some of the actions that you look for in a normal environment, a response or answer you would expect to be there that certainly doesn't show up?
Yes and no. Just as we were talking, I noticed one of the questions was, does the same tell work for everyone? Well, that's a really good question. Insofar as the body language, defensive behaviours and masking, concealment, blocking behaviours, micro-expressions and all that type of thing, they are similar. But in the content and structure area, often you'll see differences. I'll give you a great example. If I was asking you questions about what you did this morning, from the time you woke up to the time we started talking, neurologically, you would be relying on memory to recall historical events through sensory input. So what that means is you'd be able to tell me what you saw, what you heard, what you felt, conversations that took place, and anything to do with that because you lived through them. Whereas if you're fabricating or embellishing, you don't have access to those memories because you have to concoct a false memory that never existed in the first place. So what you'll find is truthful people will take ownership and include themselves. So they'll say, I woke up, I had a shower, I walked the dog. Now, if you notice, that's all singular person past tense. I walked the dog, I had a shower. What we know is when people are fabricating or embellishing or creating false memories, they will often jump between singular person past tense and present tense. Secondly, they'll delete themselves out of the conversation. So they'll say things like, I remember I was doing a presentation to a big corporate audience, and I said to everyone, I said, who here thinks they're a great liar? And a couple of people put their hands up, and I got them on stage. And I said, okay, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to tell me a couple stories. I don't care what they are, but I want one to be truthful and the other to be false, a complete fabrication. And this guy got up and he started talking about his first bungee jump. And he said things like, okay, I want to tell you a story about the first bungee jump. What he didn't say was the first bungee jump I did or I went on or I did or something like that. So there's no personal pronouns such as I or me. And then he said, you go there. What he didn't say was I went there or who he went there with. He says, then they brief you. What he didn't say was they briefed me on what to do. They take you up a ladder. When you get to the top, they tie your feet, not my feet. And often deceptive people will create distance, disassociation, and separation in language, whereas truthful people will take ownership and they'll include themselves by the use of language. But not only that, truthful people will not only tell you what they saw or what they heard, but they'll often tell you what they felt. Whereas a deceptive person, if they're fabricating something, they have to not only, it takes a lot of cognitive loading to deliver a lie with believability and credibility. And make no mistake, for every one lie you tell, you have to invent another 2 or 3 to protect yourself from the first one. So under MRI scanning, it takes a lot of cognitive loading and a lot of mental processing.
But as you mentioned, a key word that I picked up back then that you said, unless they're disassociated, because I'm thinking of the language that I use. Oftentimes I've prefaced it with the word I. I often exclude myself out, especially when talking about my childhood. Now that's a disassociation I've recognized as I'm rereading, books that I've written. And I thought, oh, isn't that an interesting way I've phrased that? I tend to keep myself out of the picture, the feelings out of the picture. And a lot of things you were speaking about then that would have actually been identified, I've actually kept out from just choice of disassociation or what enabled me at the time. So I'm curious. So that's something that you're aware of, that, it isn't quite a one size fits all. This fits perfectly if they use this language. This tends to indicate towards a direction, but look at some other factors as well.
Absolutely. And it's a valid point. Typically, there's 2 things I teach people to do, and that is firstly to benchmark behaviours and then look for deviations from that normative behaviour. So if I'm interviewing you, say for whatever it is, and I'm asking questions and I notice that the questions induce a change in you. So for whatever reason, I see blocking, masking, concealment behaviours. I see that you're uncomfortable. Well, what's important for me as an interviewer is to ask, firstly, the right questions. Because if in any interview your question is not clear and concise, it will allow a deceptive person room to wriggle out of. And to escape commitment to their assertion or their story itself. So absolutely. So I would look at determining, is there a reason why this person is not including themselves? And, I remember I ran a training course in Chicago, and I have a number of videos of different homicide cases and whatnot. And there was one particular woman in this group who could pick the behavioural cues with absolute amazing accuracy. And what I found was very interesting, and that is other people in the group had no idea. And the reason was they just listened to the content and they tried to find fault with the content. During one of the breaks, one of the that particular lady came up to me And I was quite intrigued because, I've been doing this for years and years, and I've done many homicide interviews, and this was not a talent that I was born with. This was a learned behaviour. It's like,
Yes.
people aren't born scared of snakes, spiders, heights, or mother-in-laws. They're all learned behaviours. So I had a bit of a conversation with her, and I expressed to her, I said I was pretty impressed with her, ability to decipher, but also her observations. And she said, "Oh, look, there's a reason why." And I suspected I knew what the reason was. And anyway, I was correct. What had happened was, from the age, I think she said from 6 to 13, she'd been sexually abused by her stepfather. And what had happened was, she'd become so aware of what the grooming signals were before she was sexually assaulted that, as a matter of survival, she learned to read behaviour. So it was more, rather than sitting in a classroom and learning, this was a matter of survival. And when she saw those grooming gestures, she would actually run. So
Yes.
there were different reasons why people, research shows that women are much better at behavioural observations than men, because firstly, they have more evaluation centres in their brain than men do. So that's why when men go to the fridge and you ask them to get the milk, and they say, "Where's the milk?" and they're staring straight at it, they can't see it. So men and women process information very differently. But on the point that you raised before, I would look at, if they're excluding themselves, what is the reason they're excluding themselves? And, the other thing I say to people, I don't care how well prepared someone is. It's very difficult to lie with believability and credibility. And, research shows that not only is it very difficult, research also shows that we're not very accurate at spotting a liar. And because we're influenced by the person. I remember interviewing a serial killer here in Melbourne, Victoria, for a job I was asked to work on for the Victoria Police. And he was charming, very charming.
Many of them are. Unfortunately, that's why
Absolutely.
It's the everyday ordinary person, not the monster that people tend to think that they may appear like.
Absolutely. And, what does a monster look like? Sometimes we see pictures and we're influenced by our observations too. Sometimes we draw a conclusion. How many times have you met somebody and you draw a conclusion based on that first interaction? Or somebody has told you something about someone and you've met them, and your conclusion is influenced by what you've been told. It's like movie critics, they'll write a big spiel about a movie. And then sometimes you go in there with that expectation of what you are going to receive from that video because of prior influence.
And also your own careers too. Like, I spoke for WorkSafe Victoria, and I had to laugh because one lady afterwards sent me an email and said, I found your stories quite disingenuous. And I replied and ended up communicating with her, and I discovered what it was. She was just so ingrained into finding absolutely everybody disingenuous that when someone told genuine stories in front of her, she couldn't flick out of that mode. It had become such a practice and a habit. And so that's the influence of the people and peers around you, that you're automatically thinking everyone is lying to you and not telling the truth, when in actual fact they are. So I think it might be equally important, not just covering how do you know when someone's genuinely lying to you, but how do you know when someone's genuinely being truthful?
Absolutely. I agree 100% with that. And, it's interesting, just going back to what I was saying before, I don't care how well prepared someone is when it comes to lying. They cannot possibly pre-anticipate every question that I'm likely to ask them. So if you're fabricating something, usually what you'll find, truthful people's stories remain pretty constant. There's not a lot of changes. Sometimes they may self-correct, but there's not a lot of changes. So, for example, if I was interviewing you for a homicide and a forensic pathologist established the cause of death at 7:15 p.m. last night, and I'm interviewing you, and I'll ask you questions, everything you did from, say, 3 o'clock or earlier in the day till, say, 10 p.m. So I might ask you questions like, what did you do at, say, 3 p.m.? I was working. Where were you working? at work. What time did you leave work? What time did you get home? What did you do when you got home, when you met your wife? Where did you go after that? Oh, I went to a restaurant. What was the name of the restaurant? What time did you leave? How did you get there? Have you been to the restaurant before? What was on the menu? What did you order? What did you purchase? Can you describe the waiter?
Yes. Exactly. I'm a specialist IROC trained, so that's my actual specialist skill is eliciting those hours upon hours that every single point meets up, and if it doesn't meet up, we know straight away, well, that can't be truthful.
Absolutely. So you
But
made
your average person, however, is not going to be, when hubby comes home, going to be queuing and hanging him about which route did you take, what was the weather like, what were you watching before you left, who were you with, where's Bill, Bob, Tim's phone number. So let's.
And I think that's a good thing.
Otherwise, relationships wouldn't even have the lifespan that they do at present, which apparently isn't that high. The divorce rate will skyrocket overnight.
That's why I have no friends when I play golf with my friends. So they're very cautious about lying to me about their scores.
Oh, I just put the goggles on you. We'd blinker you. We'd put the earmuffs on you, and then we put a leader out and pull you along. Come on, you can now join in the rest of the group. You can't listen to what I say or how I do it. So nothing better than a specialist who knows the most about the least.
Yeah, true.
So for our listeners, if you want to join in and ask a question of our human lie detector, go to w4cy.com and you'll have the advent of his expertise to work out if your loved ones, and especially with some tricky teenagers, I'm sort of interested on working with them because I'm going to have one soon. And my son may not be lying to me now, but if he's anything like I was, God forbid, and I certainly hope that's not my punishment to have a child as I was, what are some key things we can give to parents, especially to help them to redirect their children, steer them in a right way, to pick up on some obvious telltale, 5 simple things. If you see this, especially to be alerted in this epidemic we now have in Australia with ice, and I've got no doubt in the US, it won't just be ice, it'll be other drugs as well. And obviously we want to keep our children safe, whole and healthy till they're responsible for their own decisions and actions.
Well, firstly, most parents have a pretty good idea when their children may be lying. You think about it. You've spent from the day they're born up until their teenage years. So most parents are pretty good at spotting when their children are lying because they know them pretty well. They know their behaviours and whatnot. Now, one of the things that I would suggest is, in particular, is the question. So say, for example, you ask your son or your daughter, have you been using ice? And they say something like, why would I do something like that? That's not the person I am, or something. Well, firstly, that's avoiding the issue. But secondly, I'd be looking for, other signs. Behaviours, absolutely. Erratic behaviour, glazed eyes, incoherent speech, confusion, all those things are associated with, drug use. And they're pretty obvious if you pay attention.
Well, it may not just be drug use. It may be things like they've turned to, a different lifestyle that, would not be accepted by their parents, or other behaviours. I think in example, there's one point that I probably would disagree with you on. There are parents that have no idea what their children are getting up to. And I've dealt with many of them as they stand there and they argue with me of how their child would never have done such a thing when I've caught them red-handed doing such a thing. So they're still in such a total state of denial.
Well, being in a state of denial is very different from not observing the cues that are present before them. I mean, if you're in a state of denial, you're not going to actually pay a lot of attention to other areas or factors. I mean, it's like most mothers refuse to believe that in some cases their son may be a serial killer. And we expect that. We anticipate and we know that.
Recently, and she turned around and made the comment saying, my boy's not bad and he'd murdered 7 people. And I thought, where can you still say my boy's not bad? He was just hurt and angry.
Well, what you have to understand is human beings, we tend to minimize, rationalize and justify our behavior and our thought processes. Now, I mean, that's important to know because, and just going back to what you said, I mean, there's no doubt there are some parents who are oblivious, totally oblivious, or can't pay, or don't pay attention to certain signs, or in denial and don't want to believe that their child may be using drugs. Say, that's very different from a situation where you've got all the signs there and you refuse to believe that it's actually occurring.
Yep.
And I mean, it's like I remember talking to a mother, and she was very like a loving mother, and her daughter had turned to prostitution to feed her drug habit. And this young girl come from a very well-to-do background family, and really never wanted for anything, but just got in the wrong crowd, and and her mother was dismayed. She said, look, I had no idea. I would suspect that, not in all cases, but depending on the circumstances, that if we look hard enough, we find clues. It's very difficult, especially and I'm sure some of your viewers out there who know people who are affected by drugs. There are some behavioural cues or signs or erratic behaviour or all those type of things. But having said that, sometimes there are people that have never, ever even been confronted by somebody who's used drugs or
Yes.
have never been in that arena. So
Exactly.
they wouldn't know what to look for because they're not aware. But at the end of the day, I honestly believe if you ask the right questions, and then say, for example, your son or daughter, very evasive or deflective and whatnot, or blame their memory. Oh, I can't remember, and just generally evasive. Then red flags should go up. And I'm certainly not advocating you interrogate your children or anything but that. But I think that it's like terrorism. I mean, if you look at a lot of these terrorist acts, there's usually some form of expression, whether it be through social media of the hatred for a particular system or whatever. And sometimes we, not just in denial, we don't believe that people will or are capable of doing things. And yet sometimes these behaviours are identified but never acted upon.
Now, I was trained a long time ago, the old system of, whether they're accessing their right brain or their left brain, whether they're accessing their imagination and being creative and making it up, or whether they're accessing their memory to gain the information by the direction in which we looked with our eyes. Like, for example, when I talk, I always look up with my eyes to the left. And that's my way of recollecting, even though my memory is not the best recollection. So therefore I might pad at times with what I can't recall. So, but it still stays up to the left. So is that something that you still utilize today, or that's very old school?
No, that's very old school. Firstly, I've done this many times during presentations. I've got audience members up and I've asked them historical questions where they've had to, think back in the memory and access, their long-term memory. Now, what you'll notice, some people look up to the left, some people look up to the right, some people look down, some people look to the side.
So that you set a benchmark.
Correct. Firstly, I mean, absolutely benchmark, but
for that individual, an individual benchmark.
Correct. Absolutely, 100%. So typically, firstly, if somebody, and I do this intentionally. Sometimes I'll get people out of the audience.
So can we do this with our partner? Can we sit there and say, okay, honey, and if we know we're feeding them something that they really don't like, yes, I'm setting them up. And I say, was that good? Oh, yes, honey, lovely. And they're looking to the direction that I know is an absolute lie. Does that sort of give me an indicator then that every time they're going that direction, they're now lying to me?
Well, that's dependent on two things. Firstly, like I mentioned earlier, you have to, if you're going to lie to somebody, you have to know that what you're saying is false. Now, I do this with a lot of audience members. I get them up and I'll say, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to answer the question honestly. So I'll say, what year did you start your very first job? And then what you'll notice, sometimes some people look up to the left, some people look up to the right. And before they answer the question,
start counting their fingers and their toes.
Yeah, in some cases, absolutely. But what I'll do is I'll stop them before they answer the question. Now, the reason I do that is to show to the audience that loss of eye contact is not indicative of deception, but more so of neurological recall. So when somebody looks away before they answer the question, technically, for them to lie, not only do they have to have intention to mislead you, but they have to utter those words, knowing that what they're saying is false. So if I ask somebody a question, they look up to the left or right, and I stop them before they speak, well, then technically they haven't lied. So this is one of the biggest misconceptions about deception. A lot of people think, oh, he looked away, he must be lying. I'm looking holistically for groups of behaviours, not just single one-offs.
Yes.
And in some cultures, I do a lot of training through Southeast Asia. In some cultures, absolutely.
They won't look at you in the eyes.
Correct. And in fact, in some cultures, bowing the head and looking down is actually a sign of respect and honour. Whereas in Western society, we believe that, hang on a minute, he's looking down, he's avoiding eye contact, he must be hiding something. So culturally, we have to pay particular attention as well.
Exactly, of what is respectful. Exactly, and that's the different environments that you're in. For a lot of people that aren't traveling, and I'm just saying, but are these true? I'm just thinking, are these true in the sense of indicators for someone that is genuinely being deceptive? I'm thinking like my son, and today in our technological age, we're all bombarded with spam, be it via Facebook, in our emails, you've won this account, you've got this much money, etc., all coming in. I think people that are new to the environment, unfortunately, because they're hearing what sounds fabulous, that's the ease for selling a lie. The more people really want to believe it, the easier it is to pass it. Would that be what you would find, or?
Yeah, I agree with that. I remember running a training course for a group of HR professionals, and one of the female managers said to me, she said, I had to interview this guy, and you should have seen this guy. He was so gorgeous. And as she was talking and describing this guy, her eyes rolled back in her head, and you could just see like she was playing subconsciously with her hair. So she was really attracted to this guy. And I said to her, did he get the job? And she said, yes. I said, what was he like? And she said, terrible. There's a classic example where she was influenced by the personality. And often, the other thing too is we tend to congregate or spend time with people we like. And I was just recently in Vegas, and I spoke to an audience of about 3,000 people. And one of the speakers there was actually Richard Dreyfuss, the actor. And he played the role of Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff being the fraudster who fleeced hundreds of millions of dollars from investors. Now, a lot of the people he fleeced were family, friends, and whatnot, and they so badly wanted Madoff to invest their money. And of course, later on, we find it's a massive Ponzi scheme that collapsed and left many people out of pocket to the tune of millions and millions of dollars. But what had happened was people wanted to believe, and people were saying, we can trust this guy, and it gave him carte blanche to literally steal money from people, and people wanted to believe that they would get a great return on their investment. So I agree with you. I think we not only are we influenced by people, sometimes we're influenced to the fact that people appeal to an emotion. I remember years ago, I had dinner with a woman who was a profiler in the States.
Years ago, you had dinner. Geez, you must be hungry by now.
I am a little bit hungry. Yes.
Sorry. I'm such a literal girl.
And what happened was, she said one of her pet hates with a lot of FBI agents or investigators, they would interview somebody who'd been clinically diagnosed as a psychopath. And the word psychopathy is one of the most misunderstood words in the English language. A lot of people think psychopaths go out and kill people. Well, I can tell you that a lot of a lot of your listeners have probably worked or with somebody in the past or know somebody who has psychopathic behaviours. Now, a psychopath by definition is somebody who is recklessly indifferent to the physical, emotional pain or harm they cause their victim. There's no empathy. So to give an example, if you and I were applying...
I'll end the conversation on psychopaths because that's a whole other show, and we've only got a few more minutes sort of that I want to cover some particular skills because we've mentioned that it's easy to be fooled if you've got a confidence in a person, but it also, I would believe, be easy to be fooled once you introduce an element of doubt, which is how a lot of con men and criminals are able to overtalk
Yeah.
or overwhelm an individual. Is there another strategy that I'm missing, or they would be the main two ways that people can easily get fooled?
Well, firstly, they'll build a rapport and create a situation where they are believed. And, it's interesting because, rapport building is a fraudster's best friend. And often what they'll do is they'll make outlandish promises, and then they have to support it. So they may give them, you invest 10,000, and I give you a 50% annual return. I give you $5,000 in the first 6 months. So you should invest more money with me. So you start giving me more money, and it builds up and it builds up. So not only have I built the rapport, but I've honored that trust by giving you money back in return for your initial investment. But the problem is, sooner or later, that scheme is going to collapse. So,
And
the rapport.
the other side of that would be the threat and intimidation. Like, for example, this is a scam's going around regularly from the tax office. You owe X amount of money. If you haven't paid it, you will be taken to court, etc. And people that are unaware that that's not a policy by the taxation department are quick to pay the money because they're intimidated that their affairs might be looked into and a bigger problem ensue.
And the number one emotion that drives people more than anything else is fear. People are more driven by the
Yes,
fear of failure than the reward of success.
exactly. We'll do more to avoid fear than we ever will to gain pleasure. It's why we run from bears.
Absolutely.
It's sort of a self-survival instinct that's in us. Fear has that opportunity, but that's what's utilized by a lot of crooks. So if you had three key points that to look for to know if you're being deceived or you're being lied to, above and beyond all the others, what would those three things be?
Okay. Are there statements accompanied by contradictory non-verbal cues, such as they'll say something, but at the same time they'll shrug their shoulders and put their hand over their face? So that's more masking behaviour. Secondly, are they editing or excluding themselves from the story, such as when someone says, "then went to the shop," instead of saying, "I then went to the shop." Also, do your questions induce some sort of change in their behavior when really they're overreacting and it's not necessary? Because if your question becomes a threatening stimulus and they're not answering the question, they're being evasive, and those changes are induced as a result of your question, I ask myself, well, what is it about that question that made that person feel uncomfortable and why? So that tells me I need to go in and explore further. And finally, is the person's denials weak and lack commitment to their story, such as, "Oh, no, I don't think so. I'm not sure. I don't think I did. I believe that maybe I did." Possibly very weak language, whereas truthful people will be very direct in their denials. And that's why it's important to ensure that not only do you listen to what people say, but you watch what they do.
Exactly. Okay. And if people want to find out more about you, where can they contact you?
They can contact me on probably basically to my website, which I'll put on your site there. But it's Steve Van Aperen. That's Steve Van Aperen, one word. Van Aperen is VANAPEREN.com.
Thank you, Steve. Great to have had you on. And you have a sensational Christmas if I don't talk to you beforehand. So
Thank
for the
you,
rest of
Elizabeth.
rest of our listeners, you're listening to Until Now with Rosie Picar on W4CY Radio. If you want some other hot tips and trips and information, you can go to stevevanaperen.com on how to pick up deception without technology. And if you want motivation and inspiration, you go to kickbutt.com.au. Now, every week I always pick out a card from the Abraham Intuitive series, and my own special instruction would be always listen to your gut. First and foremost, you've got your own inbuilt radar, as has been also seconded by Steve. You've got the access and the intelligence, just use it a bit more. So from this card that I selected, it said, I can earn money by doing what I love to do. And I guess you've seen that proven today, because this is a passion that Steve has that has drawn him to become an expert in this area, in this field, and he's making great money from it. So you too, if you've got a passion, an area that you want to invest yourself into, follow that, pursue it. So as Abraham says, as you practice your own positive, better feeling story, in time, your pleasure will become the dominant vibration within you. And then as you couple your pleasure with your means of earning, the two will blend perfectly and enhance each other. There is no better way to earn money than to do the things you love to do. Money can flow into your experience through endless avenues. It is not the choice. I should have brought my glasses. It is not the choice of the craft that limits the money that flows, but only your attitude towards money. So again, your attitude towards other people, your attitude towards things is what will influence your life in the greatest detail. So I would say, if you're going to tell a lie and have to tell a lie, make it one that's worthwhile, that benefits others, makes them feel good. Finding more ways to feel good and less ways to feel bad is what our purpose is here. So it's not catching out to be bad, it's catch people out in being right. So until next week, I look forward to talking to you then. I'll have Don Tolman, the cowboy of good health, on, talking all things nutrition from nothing other than whole foods. Look, you've been listening to Until Now with Rosie Pica.